May 1945, Bavaria, Germany. American soldiers had food. German civilians were starving. U.S. policy said, "Do not feed them." General George S. Patton commanded Third Army, military governor of Bavaria, responsible for territory, responsible for population, including millions of starving civilians. Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive 1067. No fraternization, no aid to German civilians, no assistance to defeated enemy. Patton saw the crisis, reported it, requested permission to use captured German food stocks for civilian population. Washington said no. This is the story of when post-war policy collided with field reality, when military governors faced impossible situation between orders and humanitarian necessity, and how the gap between Washington directives and occupied territory eventually forced policy change. May 1945, Bavaria, Germany. American soldiers had food. German civilians were starving. U.S. policy said, "Do not feed them." Patton asked permission. Washington said no. Subscribe. Germany in 1945 was a defeated country whose Nazi regime had devastated Europe. 6 years of war, tens of millions dead, cities across continent destroyed. Holocaust had murdered 6 million Jews. Allied policies toward Germany were shaped by that experience. Victory came with a question: what to do with defeated Germany? Two visions competed. One side wanted punishment. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau proposed harsh approach: deindustrialize Germany, prevent future military capability, reduce to agricultural economy, no aid to population, let Germans face consequences of their regime's actions. Other side wanted reconstruction: rebuild Germany as stable democracy, prevent conditions that led to Nazi rise. Marshall and others supported this approach. In 1945, punishment won. September 1944, Joint Chiefs of Staff issued Directive 1067, governed occupation policy, prohibited fraternization with Germans, banned aid to civilian population, forbade use of U.S. resources for German relief. Directive's purpose was clear: Germans would not be coddled. Occupation would not be charitable. Population would face reality of defeat. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. American forces occupied assigned zones. Military governors took control. Patton's Third Army occupied Bavaria. Patton now governed millions of civilians. Many were starving. Washington policy said he could not feed them. Situation he inherited was catastrophic. Railways twisted, warehouses empty, markets silent, transportation networks destroyed. Food distribution systems collapsed. Refugees flooding from east. Displaced persons camps overflowing. Disease spreading. And widespread starvation. JCS 1067 prohibited military governors from addressing this with U.S. resources. Bavaria, May to June 1945. Population approximately 10 million, plus refugees, plus displaced persons. Infrastructure was devastated. Munich heavily damaged. Nuremberg destroyed. No functioning food distribution. Immediate crisis was humanitarian. Civilian population faced starvation. Children particularly vulnerable. Disease following malnutrition. Typhus outbreaks. Dysentery spreading. Military governors had captured German food stocks, Wehrmacht supplies, government warehouses, agricultural reserves. JCS 1067 prohibited using these for German civilians. Stocks designated for displaced persons and Allied use only. But military governors faced practical reality. Millions of starving people. Available food stocks. Policy preventing distribution. Patton reported situation to Eisenhower, requested authorization to distribute captured German food to civilian population, argued humanitarian necessity. Noted policy was creating untenable conditions. Eisenhower forwarded request to Washington, sought clarification of policy, indicated field commanders were facing impossible situation. Washington response, policy maintained. JCS 1067 remained in effect. No U.S. resources for German civilian relief. Captured stocks designated for other uses. Military governors were ordered to maintain policy regardless of field conditions. Patton asked permission to feed civilians. Washington said no. June 1945. Situation deteriorated. Starvation deaths increasing. Disease spreading. Refugees continuing to arrive from Soviet zone. Winter was 6 months away. But preparations needed to start immediately. Patton and other military governors faced choice: enforce policy strictly and watch humanitarian catastrophe, or find ways to work within policy limits while addressing reality. Documentation shows military governors adopted various approaches. Some strictly enforced directives. Others found administrative workarounds. Used captured German stocks for security purposes, arguing starvation created instability. Classified certain distributions as preventing disease outbreak rather than humanitarian aid. Patton reportedly pushed hardest against policy, made statements that policy was impractical, argued to staff that situation required flexibility regardless of Washington directives. Private statements documented frustration. Population was starving. Food stocks existed. Policy prevented distribution. The situation was impossible. Summer 1945. Gap between Washington policy and field reality widened. JCS 1067 had been designed for immediate post-surrender period. Assumed German administrative structures would handle German population. Allied forces would handle military occupation only. Reality proved different. German administrative structures had collapsed. No functioning government. No distribution systems. No organizational capacity. Military governors inherited total responsibility by default, but lacked policy authorization to address it. Reports from occupied zones indicated growing crisis. British zone facing similar problems. French zone reporting starvation. Soviet zone information limited, but conditions appeared catastrophic. American military governors continued requesting policy modification. Indicated current directives were creating unsustainable situation. Washington debate intensified. Morgenthau Plan advocates argued softening policy would undermine occupation goals. Marshall and others argued field reality required adjustment. Policy remained unchanged through summer 1945. Patton's documented statements during this period showed increasing frustration. Argued to Eisenhower that policy was creating more problems than solving. Indicated that starving population created security risks. Disease outbreaks threatened Allied troops. Refugees fleeing starvation destabilized regions. Eisenhower sympathized, but lacked authority to override JCS directive. Continued forwarding field reports to Washington. Documented gap between policy and reality. September 1945. Situation reached crisis point. Winter approaching. Food situation would worsen. Current policy unsustainable. Additionally, geopolitical situation was shifting. Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe creating concerns. Germany's future role in containing Soviet influence being reconsidered. Policy began shifting gradually. Not dramatic announcement. Incremental authorizations. Military governors given more discretion. Captured stocks authorized for civilian use under certain conditions. Patton and other commanders utilized new flexibility immediately. Distributed captured food stocks. Organized relief efforts. Addressed most critical humanitarian situations. Field reality was forcing policy adjustment. Fall 1945 through 1946. U.S. policy toward Germany underwent fundamental shift. JCS 67 remained technically in effect, but implementation changed. Military governors received expanded authority, relief efforts authorized, reconstruction planning began. Multiple factors drove change. Field reports documenting humanitarian crisis, security concerns about unstable occupied zones, shifting geopolitical situation with Soviet Union, growing recognition that stable Germany served Western interests. By 1947, policy had reversed completely. Marshall Plan proposed, massive aid to rebuild Europe, including Germany. Former enemy became ally in emerging Cold War. Directive 67 officially replaced July 1947 by JCS 779. New policy emphasized reconstruction, economic recovery, democratic development. Transformation from Morgenthau Plan to Marshall Plan took 2 years. Field reality eventually forced policy change. Patton did not see final policy shift. Died December 1945 from injuries in traffic accident. But his reports and advocacy contributed to growing recognition that initial post-war policy was unsustainable. Other military governors who pushed for policy change similarly contributed. Lucius Clay, in particular, became architect of later Reconstruction policy. May 1945 to July 1947. U.S. policy toward occupied Germany evolved from punitive to reconstructive. Initial policy reflected immediate post-war anger. Nazi regime had caused catastrophic destruction. Allied populations demanded Germany face consequences. JCS 1067 embodied that approach. Harsh occupation, no aid, no fraternization, no reconstruction assistance. But policy encountered field reality. Military governors inherited total responsibility for occupied territories. German administrative capacity had collapsed. Humanitarian crisis developed. Gap between Washington policy and field necessity created impossible situation for commanders like Patton. Orders prohibited actions that field conditions required. Military governors responded variously. Some strictly enforced policy. Others found workarounds. Some, like Patton, actively pushed for policy change. Gradually, reports from field convinced Washington that policy adjustment was necessary. Not from sympathy for Germans, from recognition that unstable occupied zones served no one's interests. Geopolitical shift accelerated change. Soviet behavior transformed Germany from defeated enemy to potential ally. Cold War emerging, Germany's role reconsidered. By 1947, policy had reversed. Marshall Plan represented complete transformation. Massive reconstruction aid, democratic development emphasis, economic integration. Patton's advocacy during summer 1945 was one factor among many driving this evolution. Field reports from multiple military governors documented same problems. Combined pressure eventually forced policy reconsideration. This pattern repeated across post-war Reconstruction. Initial punitive impulses gave way to pragmatic recognition that stable former enemies served Western interests better than destabilized zones. Japan followed similar trajectory. Initial occupation harshness softened. Reconstruction emphasis emerged. Former enemy became Cold War ally in Pacific. Pattern was systemic. Post-war policy adjusted when field reality demanded. Ideology yielded to practical necessity. Summer 1945, Bavaria. Patton commanded Third Army. Millions of civilians under military government. Widespread starvation. Available food stocks. Policy prohibited distribution. Patton pushed back against policy. Reported humanitarian crisis. Requested authorization for relief. Argued field reality required flexibility. Request denied initially. Policy maintained. But Patton and other military governors continued documenting problems. Eventually, accumulated field reports forced policy reconsideration. Not immediately. Not from single commander's advocacy, but from systemic recognition that initial approach was unsustainable. This was not story of lone hero defying orders, was story of policy colliding with reality, of field commanders reporting gap between directives and field conditions, of gradual policy evolution driven by accumulated evidence. Patton's role was significant but not unique. Multiple military governors faced same dilemma, reported same problems, advocated same solutions. Policy changed because field reality made initial approach impossible, not because single commander rebelled, because system eventually recognized initial policy was failing. Germany in 1945 faced humanitarian catastrophe as consequence of Nazi regime's actions and war's destruction. U.S. policy initially prohibited addressing this. Military governors inherited responsibility without authority. Gap between policy and reality created tension. Field commanders documented problems, pushed for flexibility, eventually influenced policy evolution. By 1947, policy had transformed completely. From Morgenthau Plan to Marshall Plan. From punitive occupation to Reconstruction Partnership. Patton, in summer 1945, was early voice advocating this shift. His reports contributed to eventual change. But change came from broader recognition across military government that initial policy was unsustainable. Post-war policy toward defeated Germany evolved through collision between Washington directives and field reality. Military governors like Patton documented the gap. Policy eventually adjusted. Not simple story of orders defied. Complex story of policy evolution driven by field conditions. Policy versus reality. Washington versus field. Initial vision versus practical necessity. Field reality won. Washington wrote the policy. The field broke it. Reality rewrote it. That was the pattern that shaped post-war Europe. May 1945. Policy banned feeding Germans. Summer 1945. Field commanders pushed back. July 1947. Policy reversed. Not from one man's rebellion, from system recognizing field reality. Washington wrote the policy. The field broke it. Reality rewrote it. Subscribe.